So this year, 2025, I just sold off a 2-bed 1-bath unit at Forward at Bukit Timah, standing at about 570 square feet. As I was selling this unit, right, I was studying actually what's the difference between a 2-bed 1-bath and a 2-bed 2-bath. So this is something I wanted to share on why, if you're buying for investment purposes, a 2-bed 1-bath will make more investment sense as compared to a 2-bed 2-bath. And we've seen a lot of this in other examples as well. So let me just show you why it might be better off buying a 2-bed 1-bath instead of a 2-bed 2-bath in this kind of scenario if you're buying for investment. Okay, so one, if you look at a 2-bed 1-bath versus a 2-bed 2-bath at selling residences, 2-bed 1-bath sits at about 1.4 million. A 2-bed 2-bath sits at about 1.6 to 1.7 million. So this is a 200 to 250k gap that you're talking about, right? So in that sense, you will need to pay additional 200k more to top up for a 2-bed 2-bath. If let's say you're buying for investment purposes, if we want to compare the rental pricing, because if you're buying for investment purposes, most likely you're looking at more of a rental yield kind of objective, right? So for rental price between a 2-bed 1-bath and a 2-bed 2-bath at selling residences, you see that between the two layout types, right, the PSF is about the same. So at $6 to $7. So there's almost a $0 gap. That means today, if you buy a 2-bed 1-bath at 1.4 million versus if you buy a 2-bed 2-bath at 1.6 million, the rental price that you get is the same. So there's no difference in that. Yeah, so from that angle, same rental price for up to 100 to 250k lower. So from an investment point of view, it makes sense. From a rental yield point of view, in terms of the difference, for 2-bed 1-bath, you're getting about 3.6%, versus a 2-bed 2-bath at that kind of quantum, you're looking at about 3%. So basically, an additional 100 to 250k investment is going to give me $600 lesser every single month. And I can save that 100k, right? If let's say I have a spare 100k to put in, I save 100k and use it elsewhere. So today we look at Forward at Bukit Timah, right, which is the one that I just sold. 2-bed 1-bath versus a 2-bed 2-bath at Forward at Bukit Timah. A 2-bed 1-bath is at 1.38 million. Right, a 2-bed 2-bath, it's at 1.7 to 1.77 million. So in this case, you see that the gap is much bigger, right? It's almost 400k kind of difference. And this is all sub-sale units. That means the owner has taken their keys and then they have already sold it on the market today. So as a second owner. A rental price today, if a 2-bed 1-bath and a 2-bed 2-bath at Forward Bukit Timah, there aren't many transactions right now. But if you look at the price that people are marketing at right now, right? The 2-bed 1-bath, they're marketing at 4,001. 2-bed 2-bath can be even 4,000. So I wouldn't be surprised if now the prices have gone down a bit because suddenly there's an influx of supply and then not many tenants are around kind of looking at the area. So this is like a 100k gap, which can potentially be yield elsewhere. So the rental yield difference in this case, right, we're looking at 2-bed 1-bath, 3.4% based on the quantum that you're buying into. And then it's more obvious right now at 2-bed 2-bath because the quantum is much higher. Your rental yield is only sitting at about 2.8%. So this is a 0.6% yield difference, savings almost at 400k. It's just something I want to share. This is not just for foreign and selling residences. If there are places that have higher rental yield, for example, then it makes sense to go for a 2-bed 1-bath because your returns on investment is higher. But if you're going to the far end of OCR region, right, and where you know that the demand pool is mostly for own stay, then a 2-bed 2-bath will be safer. So this is something I just wanted to share. It really depends on the objectives that you are looking at and then deciding, okay, based on that criteria, based on that objective, what should you be looking at as a buyer today? Because it's not so easy to be able to find something that's value buy in the market today. That's something that you need to really pay very good attention to and where your objectives are before you think about pulling the trigger on a purchase, especially in today's market.